Hi everybody and welcome to the End of the World Reading Club Extra, and this is our first book haul edition. Earlier this month I realised I'd not really bought many books since the beginning of lockdown and it was time to make a change. So I went online, spent loads of money on books, and have since acquired a few more. So this seemed like a good opportunity to tell you what I bought and trail some of the books that we're going to be talking about in the End of the World Reading Club, in Cosmia Festival 2020 and Cosmia Festival 2021. So I have the books arrayed here. I'm going to talk you through very briefly all the books, why I bought them, why I think they're interesting, and in some cases when I'm going to be talking to you about them in more depth. There's some other books on here which aren't part of the haul, but I wanted to talk about anyway, and this seemed like as good an excuse as any. So the inspiration for this haul not only was the fact that I realised I hadn't bought any books for a while, but also I read a really interesting blog which I've linked in the description, which was talking about writers from non-Western traditions. As I was reading the blog, I was adding books to the cart. I topped that up with books that were in and around the Cosmia 2020 festival theme of it's the end of the world as we know it, so climate change or apocalyptic fiction. And when I got to about 10 books or so, I pressed buy, and then they all started to come in over the following week or so. So that's the book we've got here. So what I thought I'd start by is talking about the climate change apocalyptic fiction side, because that is the festival this year. The first one of those I'm going to talk about is Veronica Roth, Chosen Ones. I've not read any of the Divergent stories. I know nothing about them apart from they're very popular, their films are popular, but this really stood out to me as a story. The plot of The Chosen Ones, from what I can gather, is that the storyline follows a group of adults who, when they were young people, saved the world, and years later are dealing with the PTSD that comes from that, and a call to action again, I think, to save the world again, whilst they're still trying to process the first time round. This is perhaps a bit of ground that an author like Stephen King has covered before, but not necessarily many other writers. So I think really interesting, really relevant for today as we start to think about how we're going to deal with processing the feelings and emotions that have come to us through the pandemic. So the next one on the list is M.R. Carey, The Book of Kowal. I've not read any M.R. Carey either, although I know that previous books have been incredibly successful and popular. The Book of Kowal is kind of outside of the walls. There's a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape that somebody ventures into. Again, this felt super relevant for this year, so I'm going to get into that one at some point very soon. Next one on the list is a classic that I'd never heard of. And no one I know had never heard of either. This is Kavan or Kavan's Ice. The author was writing in the first half of the 20th century or so. I think this was published in the 60s. It's a post-apocalyptic nuclear dystopia. So a global cooling rather than a warming, but similarly a man-made end to the planet and a kind of chase that happens through it. Next one on the list is Eden by Tim Lebbon. This again, really interesting premise. That the oceans have risen and have left us with not very much land, and a lot of land has been given over to trying to regenerate plant life and save the planet. And then this is, from what I can gather, is going to be a kind of rip-roaring thriller as our characters experience that world and go on some adventures. Next one, and you can see I'm skipping a couple, is The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. I've heard a lot about this book. I'd not got around to buying it. I've also pre-ordered the sequel, which is due out later this year, because I really want to be invested in the world that Mary Robinette has created. So the plot of this is that a meteorite in the 1950s has caused global warming and the planet is doomed, so female astronauts go off into space to try and solve all of our problems. The moon, then Mars. Really looking forward to this. I'm really looking forward to the 50s setting as much as anything else. So this one will be on the End of the World Reading Club list very soon. So then the last book from this kind of mini haul of post-apocalyptic stories is what's going to be the August End of the World Reading Club book, The City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Anders. Set on a dying planet that's half darkness, half light, and two cities straddle the border. I'm all about that kind of story. Really, really interesting and really interesting kind of setting. A female protagonist, which is great. Somebody being exiled into the night, so surviving in a wasteland. Again, really tied thematically to some of these other stories. So please buy this. Please read it quickly and come talk to me about it in August. Also, love the blue. Very cool. Now we come to the other side, which is the blog that I read, looking at non-Western tradition writers of particularly fantasy. Our last book club, as I record this, was Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James, which was a really challenging, interesting story inspired by non-Western traditions, myths and history. I wanted to go further into that world. Our festival theme next year will be exploring the breadth and the diversity of stories and storytellers in contemporary science fiction, fantasy and speculative fiction, and looking back at writers that maybe haven't been featured as part of the Western canon and that have been telling interesting stories for a long time. So I wanted to push myself, and I recommend all of you push yourself to read books you've not read before, and that's what these represent. They're also, I think, from memory, the whole purchase was a few weeks ago, some YA, some young adult content, which as a man who's getting very close to 40 isn't necessarily something I normally read, but again, why not? I'm looking forward to reading these stories and pushing myself to enjoy things that I wouldn't normally pick up. So the first one of those is An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. All of these I hope I pronounced correctly. So this is a orphan fighting for a family, a soldier searching for his freedom, and a story. You've got people going undercover as slaves, fate, desire, loads of stuff. I'm looking forward to it. It's got a great cover. The next book with a great cover is The Bloodprint. This is by Ausma Zehanat Khan. Again, I know I'm not pronouncing that right. Please leave in the comments how I should be pronouncing it. This I'm super excited about as well. The cover art, again, really nice. So in this one, we're looking at superstitious patriarchy, cruel and terrifying, and a kind of resistance against that. And this has got some really interesting thematic links, I hope, with a book that I'm going to come on to near the end of the video. Third book in a row with incredible cover art is The Bird King by Willow Wilson. Really interested in the setting of this one, not only because it's set in Muslim Iberia, but also because it's set in a really interesting point of time when the Christian Western world and the Islamic Eastern world are meeting and contesting in Spain and Portugal. It's a concubine and a map maker, which seems like a great combination for story protagonists. So again, super excited about that one. And finally, we've got We Hunt the Flame by Hafsah Faizal. This one seems to me to be the most YA of all of them, I think, looking at the cover art. So this is a hunter, female hunter, I think, disguising herself as a man, braving the cursed forest. So it should be really, really cool adventure, and it's a really good size, I think, for a story as well. I did buy one more book, which is The Stylist Sea by Erin Morgenstern. Didn't buy this, online with all the other ones, and this is really a shout out to new friends of the festival. As we've been putting together our plans for this year, for 2020, I reached out to a bookshop quite local to us here in Huddersfield, Reed Holmfirth, which is in a village just outside. If you're from the UK, it is Last of the Summer Wine territory. And my partner in crime at Cosmia and I realised we'd never been. We needed to go, so about 3 days later we were in the shop, masks on, wallets in hand, and we both came away with some books, which was great. I absolutely adored The Night Circus. It's a beautiful story, it's a fascinating conceit, it's crying out for an amazing TV adaptation. So I'm really looking forward to getting into the Stylist C. Set in a library, which I love. There's a labyrinth. It's kind of maybe a story about stories, which I often really love. So this is high up on my list, and courtesy of a great bookshop. So if you're from this part of the world, from West Yorkshire, highly recommend going there. They had a really great selection of books, really well curated. There'll be something there that you will absolutely love. Now, there are 3 books left on my little display shelf here that I haven't talked about yet. First one of those I've already mentioned very slightly. It's The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. In the coming weeks, I'm going to be filming and uploading a short review of this book. It's not going to be a full End of the World reading club book, but I absolutely loved it. I think it's a really interesting, intellectual and exciting story that I want to share my experiences of with you and hopefully persuade you to read it if you haven't already. So watch out for that one, it's coming quite soon. Similarly, we've got Rotherweird by Andrew Caldecott. I've read all 3 of these in the sequence. These are great, I love them. So at some point this year, probably December after the festival's finished and we need a light relief from all the apocalyptic climate changey stuff, we'll probably talk about this book. Now the final book is another trailer for some content. This is another amazing book cover. This is The Mechanical Maestro by Emily Owen. My disclaimer is I work with Emily and she has published this book this year. I'm most of the way through it and really enjoying it. So Emily and I are going to sit down over Zoom at some point, have a conversation about the book, and that will be our first author interview on the channel, hopefully not the last. This book is set in a Victorian London. It's steampunks and clockwork androids. It's got a really nice vibe, nice feel, really interesting ideas, so watch out for that content as well. Hopefully the books on here will inspire you to make some purchases or to read some of the ones that I've talked about so that we can chat about them later on. As ever, stay safe and we'll see you very soon.